Hi everyone, welcome to this webinar on the key findings and recommendations for our 2025 renewable energy and human rights benchmark. We're going to get started as more people are joining. Welcome everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending where you are, or good evening perhaps. My name is Caroline Avant, and I'm the head of the Natural Resources and Just Energy Transition team at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. So I'm joined here today by my colleagues Blanca Racionero Gomez, who is our senior researcher in our Just Energy Transition team, and Anash Bona, who is co-head of our Human Rights Defenders and Civic Freedoms program. We'll start with a presentation of the key findings and recommendations for this year's benchmark of renewable energy companies, and then we'll have 15 to 20 minutes for your questions. You can use the Q&A box that you can see on your screen to ask your question. You can also upvote questions. And then we will get to your questions in the last part of the presentation today. This webinar is recorded and will be later available online. If you can go to the next slide, please, Blanca. Next, please. So I just want to start with a few words about the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, if you're not familiar with our organization. We are a human rights organization focused on the roles and responsibilities of business actors, and we've been around for 20 years now. And our mission is to work with partners and allies to put human rights at the heart of business to deliver a just economy, climate justice, and end abuse. And we focus on 3 strategic goals for our work on renewable energy value chains. First, we look at shared prosperity, moving away from business as usual approaches and adopting new business models that are rights-based and give better access to decision-making and benefit sharing to communities and indigenous peoples. We also insist on the need for social protection and human rights protection. We need governments to fulfill their duties to protect human rights and increased policy attention to disenfranchised communities in this energy transition. And lastly, we also insist on the importance of fair negotiations between workers, communities, and businesses, and respect for the rights of indigenous people to free prayer and informed consent. Here you can see on the slide a few of our recent resources. So today we're going to focus on our renewable energy and human rights benchmark. If you can go to the next slide, Blanca, please. Thank you so much. So just a few words on the purpose of the renewable energy and human rights benchmark. What we know as a human rights organization that there's no doubt that responding to climate change with great urgency is a human rights imperative. And the only way to respond to it with the urgency it deserves is to accelerate on the deployment of wind and solar capacity on the ground. We also need massive electrification efforts. And this means that we need scale and we need speed. And that is already a huge challenge in and out of itself. But there's also a challenge within the challenge. How do we do this in a way that is fair, that is just? And the reality is that this massive overhaul of energy systems is taking place in a world of geopolitical tensions and deep inequalities, many of which are driven by the current energy model, as well as by deep flows and power asymmetries in the current global economic order. We also know that the deployment of this type of large infrastructure projects that wind and solar projects are also taking place in areas where communities have already been impacted by resource extraction. So there's a risk that this could repeat historical abuses. We also know that these issues are not only materializing at project siting level, but also through supply chains, from forced labor concerns in solar panels manufacturing all the way up to the extraction of the minerals needed for the manufacturing of wind and solar technologies. We've also been tracking allegations of abuses in mining for transition minerals for more than a decade. And that's why we created the benchmark in 2021 to provide clarity on the policies of companies, developers, and manufacturers who are engaged in that transformation and accelerate the movement and stimulate a new conversation on the responsibilities of companies. So the benchmark really provides support to companies on how to respond to these risks, also provides information for investors to drive their engagement with companies and governments in prioritizing areas for policy reforms, as well as, of course, for global civil society, scrutinizing how private sector actors are dealing with risks in renewable energy value chains. If you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Just to take you through our methodology for the renewable energy and human rights benchmark, where we have assessed for this year 35 leading developers and manufacturers in the wind and solar sector. So our methodology is based on 4 different key dimensions and was developed after following consultations with partners and experts. So the first dimension is that we look for alignment of companies' policies with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. The other key area that we look at is around key salient risk areas. So we have 10 different dimensions from how companies approach respect for indigenous people's rights, to land rights, to engagement with communities, protection of human rights defenders, other areas such as labor rights, corruption, and so on and so forth. We also look at the gap between policy and practice through a review of serious allegations or risk of exposure to certain serious issues in the sector, and that's our third bucket. And finally, we also look at how developers and utilities are planning, investing, and adopting low-carbon transition plans. We have different indicators for manufacturers and developers, and everything is available online, which I'm going to also explain in the next slide. If you could go to, thank you. So before we look at the key findings from this year's benchmark, the benchmark comes in different products. We have a briefing, we have a database summarizing results, we have an investor primer, which outlines recommendations specifically for an investor audience. We also have individual scorecards for companies, which are very detailed. We've collected close to 6,000 data points for this year's benchmark. That's about 160 per company, and everything is available on our website. And finally, our methodology document is also available online and can be used to inform human rights approaches for companies. So now if you can. So now we're going to look at the key findings before we dig into 4 deep dives issues that we've looked at for this year's benchmark. So thank you. So just to take you through our key findings for this edition. First, we are seeing some progress at policy level, with close to 70% of companies having progressed or maintained their scores on core policies aligned with the UN guiding principles. Second, unfortunately, we also see that serious gaps remain. We are seeing low scores across the board on salient issues such as land and resource rights or indigenous people's rights. The third interesting point also to note for this year's benchmark is that EU-based companies continue to lead the pack. But we also have seen that other companies have also made noticeable progress. But we will look in a second, we will look at the ranking of companies. Another area which deserves attention is on the fact that one crucial gap that we see in the benchmark today is around disclosure of solar supply chains. We asked companies for the second time about their efforts to transparently disclose supply chain, which is the only way to build accountable efforts in response to the severe issue of forced labor in the Xinjiang Autonomous Region of China, and we found that no company has done that so far. And finally, we also looked at how companies, like I said, we look at low carbon transition plans for developers and utilities still engaged in oil and gas production, and we found that the oil and gas sector is lagging behind, as their score on average for this section stood at 23% on average, and that's compared to 52% for other developers. If you can go to the next slide, thank you so much. So here you can see, if you can actually see what is on the slide, because maybe it's a little bit small, but this is in our briefing in any case. That's our overall ranking of companies across the different categories. We have developers, we have independent power producer, we have oil and gas companies, wind, solar, wind solar manufacturers, wind turbine manufacturer and solar panel manufacturer. So that's 5 different categories, which you can see. As you can appreciate also in this slide, we see progress. That's the green bar that you see, progress basically across the board. And like I said, the leading companies tend to be EU-based, and so that is potentially the result of an anticipation on their part of the upcoming CSDDD. For the first time, we have companies above 50%, and that's also something that is quite noticeable. You can go to the next, Blanca, please. Where companies have made the most progress is around alignment with core UN guiding principles. But more progress is also happening in other areas, as you can see on this slide, for example, on transparency and anti-corruption, also around respect for human rights defenders, which we are going to discuss in a minute. But as you can see, also there's still a big difference between alignment on core UN guiding principles indicators and other salient risk area. So if you can go to next, please. So in the next section for the presentation today, you're gonna hear from Blanca and Anna about 4 important deep dives on salient issues for renewable energy and human rights today. The first area that we looked at is around responsible mineral sourcing, engaging with upstream mineral supply chain and interrogating the risk associated with being linked to human rights abuses happening in the extraction of transition minerals is critical to navigate related risk and potential supply chain disruption. So that's one area that we have interrogated in this year benchmark. Another very important area is on respect for indigenous people's rights. We've continued to record allegations of violations of the right of indigenous peoples in our work at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, and that's an area where we have also done more work in this year's benchmark. The third area is around shared prosperity through benefit sharing, through approaches such as co-ownership or revenue sharing options. We know from our work at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center that these models, when they are rights respecting, they are not only desirable, but they are also feasible. And we believe that they offer pathways for sustainable energy production. So we've also looked into that this year. And finally, and last but not least, human rights defenders. This is a time of great threats on civic freedoms, and without the ability to freely voice concerns, wind and solar projects may be resisted. And we've also insisted on that in this year's benchmark in our engagement with companies. So with that, I will leave you with Blanca for the 3 first deep dives, followed by Anna.
Thank you, Caroline. So going into deep dive 1 on responsible mineral sourcing, and just to explain a little bit, for each of the deep dive, we will explain a little bit the indicators we base the assessment on. Then we will explain the core findings we extracted, analyzing the indicators results, and then we will explain the recommendations that we suggest taking forward. So on responsible mineral sourcing, we used a set of key indicators tailored to project developers from the one hand or manufacturers from the other that are explained in depth in our methodology. But in essence, what we looked at were first that policies stating commitment to responsible mineral sourcing aligned with the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible supply chains of minerals. And we looked that if this alignment was covering all minerals, not only 3TGs, which is something that we normally observed. And we also looked for an expectation of all business relationships to commit to the same. Then we also looked at the process to identify, map suppliers and disclose suppliers. And finally, we also looked at the process used to identify and prioritize risks and impact. Again, full detail on indicators can be found on the methodology. And what did we find this year on responsible mineral sourcing? So good news is that we found progress across the board. Since the last benchmark, we saw that both solar panel manufacturers and wind turbine manufacturers improved their scores across the 3 indicators in average. However, the sector remains far below international standards. And just to comment on wind turbine manufacturers, you'll see in the graphic here that it seems that there's been no progress. But actually, this is because the number of companies assessed in this category increased significantly, and the scores of the new companies were quite low. So in reality, there's been an improvement if we only take into account the companies that were assessed in 2023 and the companies that were also assessed in 2025. With regards to project developers, we see that they are starting to adopt some steps on responsible sourcing, but it still remains a nascent practice. Finally, we also found that notably solar panel manufacturers and project developers fail to disclose their full solar panel supply chains, as Caroline mentioned at the beginning, which is key to demonstrate no exposure to forced labor in Xinjiang. And therefore, to put it in other words, the risk of exposure to forced labor in solar polysilicon supply chains remains very high. We recognize that responsible mineral sourcing is not easy, and it is not something that can be done from one day to another. So it is something to build upon gradually. And we observe many challenges from companies to achieve responsible mineral sourcing, including, for instance, the lack of supply chain transparency and disclosure, cutting across several layers of disclosure, including, for instance, between suppliers and buyers, or disclosure to authorities and auditors, or public disclosure. We also saw as a challenge the current geopolitical landscape, including the rollback of policies and financial support for the renewable energy. Another challenge that we saw is the lack of capacity and resources internally to map supply chains and complete comprehensive human rights due diligence processes. And finally, we observed challenges to address systemic issues that go beyond individual companies or that go even beyond the sector, because it requires the involvement of other key stakeholders, including governments and investors. And so what do we think that can be done to address those challenges? The deep dive, I want to reiterate, has detailed actions and links to relevant resources and initiatives to undertake those actions. Here I'll only present a snapshot of what appears in the deep dive, but please go back to the deep dive to see all the detail. The first key action that we think is very relevant is to introduce a responsible mineral sourcing policy with C-suite oversight, clear responsibilities, and resource allocation. Then another important action is to align the due diligence policy and processes with the OECD guidance on responsible mineral sourcing for all minerals, not only 3TG. A third key action is to undertake traceability and risk-based mapping of key mineral supply chains, but refraining from acting only on problematic mining, processing, smelting, and refining facilities the company is connected to, and instead consider risks in mineral value chains as systemic and elevate sector-wide expectations for responsible business conduct. And finally, another action to take is to engage with peers, including in other sectors such as the automotive sector or the electronic sector, to improve sector-wide practices and advocate for strong legislation and standards for the mining sector that uphold human rights. Now, looking at indigenous people's rights, so that's the second deep dive, we used, again, different indicators to assess indigenous people's rights that are explained in the methodology, but summarizing, key indicators for project developers include policy commitment to respect indigenous people's rights through operations and value chains, explicitly referencing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Then we also looked for the processes for identifying indigenous peoples, the commitment to FPIC, and finally, an example of FPIC. So these were the indicators that we used to assess for project developers. And then for manufacturers, we mainly looked at two things. The first one is a demonstration of a commitment to only work with business partners that respect FPIC, and then a policy commitment on indigenous people's rights. Again, all the detail can be found in the methodology. I won't explain everything now. What did you find in this case? We found that both project developers and manufacturers have room to strengthen their policies and practices to respect the rights of indigenous peoples and in their operations. However, there are encouraging signs the sector is considering the risks associated with industry standards and national regulations that don't offer sufficient protection on indigenous people's rights. It is important to highlight that only 2 out of 22 project developers have a policy commitment referencing UNDRIP and extended to business partners. And only 1 company has a full commitment to FPIC. So there's a lot of room to improve. Worryingly, we also found out that violations of indigenous people's rights constituted the highest proportion of the serious allegations that we collected in this year's benchmark, highlighting severe gaps between policy and practice. Only 5 companies responded to the allegations of violations of indigenous people's rights, with only 1 company providing a detailed response. Although 2 companies engaged with stakeholders and 1 company identified and implemented improvements, no company investigated and took appropriate action to remedy impacts and to prevent similar impacts from occurring in the future. In terms of challenges, we observed that there is a lack of effective legislation in many countries that requires FPIC and indigenous peoples, as well as meaningful, sustained community engagement throughout the life cycle of the project. Another challenge is that indigenous people's rights are often not considered a priority internally, and therefore it is challenging to adopt stronger positions on indigenous people's rights. And finally, another challenge is that, once again, as we observed in other deep dives, is that there's a lack of capacity and resources internally to address these issues. To address those key challenges, we suggest to project developers and utilities 3 things, and then one recommendation is for manufacturers at the end. So the 3 things that we suggest for project developers, and again, these are a summary of recommendations, a full detailed recommendations can be found on the deep dive, is to first adopt a policy level commitment to respect indigenous people's rights and extend this expectation to all business partners in the value chain. Then another thing is to commit to fully respecting indigenous people's right to FPIC, including their right to define the process by which FPIC is achieved, and the right to withhold consent regardless of an opposing claim by the government. And finally, we also recommend to project developers and utilities to disclose processes for identifying indigenous peoples and legitimate tenure holders, including customary or traditional lands, territories, and resources where ownership rights might not be formally recorded. Finally, a key action for manufacturers is that they should adopt clear expectations towards all business partners, including project developer clients and upstream mineral suppliers, to adopt a policy-level commitment to respect indigenous people's rights and FPIC in particular. Now, going into deep dive 3, which focused on shared prosperity, the indicators that we used to assess engagement with affected communities included basically 2 things. One is the engagement with actual engagement with affected communities, including a description and examples of engagement. And then we also assessed the benefit and ownership sharing steps taken by the company. On shared prosperity, we found significant progress on engagement with affected communities. And while no company has adopted a formal policy commitment to identify potential benefit and ownership sharing options, two project developers demonstrate examples of better practice around co-ownership and prioritizing community decision-making in benefit-sharing arrangements in renewable energy projects. Therefore, we see some progress on commitment to benefit and ownership options, which is promising. On this end, on the challenges, we observed quite a few challenges to achieve shared prosperity, including lack of interest and limitations to companies' internal resources and capacity, once again, limitations around community engagement, governance, and processes, which again include lack of resources for communities to engage with companies and serve as partners for co-ownership agreements. We also saw that it's challenging for companies to establish trust with communities and to ensure that benefit sharing arrangements support social cohesion rather than social division. And finally, we also saw that there are challenges to access capital and advantageous financing arrangements for communities. In terms of key actions to address those challenges, we recommend to adopt a commitment to identify potential benefit and ownership sharing options with affected communities and indigenous peoples, including through exploring co-ownership models. We also recommend to strengthen internal capacity and knowledge, including at board and senior management level and in sustainability departments on shared prosperity business models. We also think it is important to ensure engagement processes are well planned and resourced. And finally, we see it is very important to prioritize communities' right to decide on their own priorities regarding how they may benefit from project. And it's very important to refrain from adopting a one-size-fits-all approach. Thank you. And now I'll pass the floor to Anna, who will talk about the fourth and final deep dive.
Hi, everyone. So I will present a deep dive on protecting human rights defenders. And firstly, I just want to start by briefly explaining who defenders are, in case this is a new term for some of you. So defenders are individuals who, alone or with others, are peacefully taking a stance to promote or protect their rights. They can be journalists, indigenous peoples, NGO workers, unionists, or simply just individuals doing what they can to protect their lands, their environment, their families, etc. Yet for that, they often face serious risks, from threats and violence to baseless legal charges and all the way to murder. These attacks are global and span all business sectors, including the renewable energy sector. And at the Research Center, we have tracked over 6,400 such attacks against defenders linked to business over the past decade. And unfortunately, we know that that's just the tip of the iceberg. So businesses have a responsibility, as we know, to respect human rights. And we argue that the only way to do that is to also respect those who defend them. So we are saying in the benchmark that supporting defenders and civic freedoms should not be seen as optional or some kind of an add-on by renewable energy companies, but as essential to building a truly sustainable sector. Next slide, please. So what did we assess under this theme? The benchmark examined whether companies publicly commit to zero tolerance for threats, violence, legal intimidation, surveillance, and other forms of attack on defenders. We also looked at whether companies hold their business partners to those standards. We looked at whether they engage with defenders, both in risk assessment and in due diligence. And finally, we looked at whether companies work with defenders to create or preserve what we call a safe and enabling environment for the defense of rights. Next slide, please. So what do we find out? The results show that wind and solar companies are making progress, especially on policy adoption. 8 companies now have zero tolerance policies for attacks on defenders, and this has been an important area of growth in the benchmark. Ørsted investors also expect their business partners to do the same. However, far fewer we have found have disclosed procedures to prevent reprisals against defenders, and no company is currently described working with defenders or using their leverage to proactively preserve civic freedoms and an enabling environment for the defense of rights. And this discrepancy, of course, points to a very common challenge, which is that policy development often precedes implementation, which then tends to lag significantly behind. Next slide, please. So why is that? What have we found out in some of the interviews with companies and just through our own research in terms of challenges in making additional progress in this area? Firstly, we know that civic space restrictions limit companies' understanding of potential human rights impacts, broadly speaking, but also those same restrictions can cause a perception that attacks on defenders are less severe, that they're not happening in companies' supply chains, leaving them unaware of these risks and how to address them. Secondly, we have seen, and this is especially over the past few years, geopolitical tensions, growing authoritarianism has been leading some companies to avoid explicitly naming defenders in their policies or publicly supporting them. Thirdly, we have seen in this sector a slower uptake of collective action than in some other sectors. So while industry associations in other sectors such as mining and consumer goods and extractives have adopted already collective policies and guidelines on defenders, renewable energy associations have yet to prioritize this issue. And fourth, as with other deep dives, we have seen lack of training and internal capacity as another issue. So the good news is that over the past decade, defenders, civil society, UN bodies, governments, and also some companies and investors have built a strong framework to better support and engage with defenders. I'll mention some seminal reports, such as Shared Space Under Pressure, the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights Guidance on Defenders, but also other tools like the consistent monitoring of attacks by global and national organizations, including Frontline Defenders, Global Witness, ourselves, networks like Alliance for Land, Environmental and Indigenous Defenders and the Zero Tolerance Initiative, which connect defenders around the world. And last but not least, the Business Network on Civic Freedoms and Defenders. These and other initiatives have all moved this agenda forward. So renewable energy companies taking full advantage of these resources, tools, and networks can do a lot to translate good intentions into practical results. So I'll just finish by pointing out principal actions to take. First of all, adoption and implementation of policy commitments, explicitly naming defenders and zero tolerance for attacks on them, communicating the same expectations to business partners. Secondly, accompanying policy commitments with implementation guides and really being explicit about how this is being implemented, learning from some companies in other sectors that have already done so. Thirdly, showing support for civic freedoms and engaging consistently with defenders, including those that may be critical of their company. Fourthly, collective action, as we said, following the lead of other industries. And last but not least, evaluating not just the risks of action in support of defenders and civic freedoms, but also the risks of inaction. What I mean by this is that sometimes companies tend to see action in support of defenders, activists, civic space as inherently political and sort of shying away from it. However, we have seen time and time again how engaging with defenders, supporting these freedoms is ultimately in the best interest of both civil society and progressive companies. So I'll just finish by saying that, as Caroline said, given that civic freedoms are rapidly declining around the world, it is really imperative that companies move quickly towards implementation and action in this theme. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna and Blanca. Maybe if you can go to the final slide, Blanca. Sorry. With this. Yeah, that's it. So now we have some space for your questions. Maybe as you're reflecting on them, just a few words as to highlight our main takeaways for this year's renewable energy and human rights benchmark. Again, like we said, we're seeing progress at a policy level, and that's really encouraging to see. And that's happening in a context where we know that renewable energy companies have been facing financial headwinds, political uncertainties, not to mention adversarial policies in certain jurisdictions. So that needs to be recognized. This progress needs to be recognized. There are areas for additional progress on certain salient human rights risks, but there are also, areas where we are seeing that the renewable energy sector is already playing a more leadership role, and so that includes the progress we've seen around the protection of respect for human rights defenders. And finally, that the sector has so much potential to build not only the future of our energy systems, but also look at new business models for shared prosperity. So I think we have 2 questions that have not been. Okay, now we have 3 questions. Okay. We have 1 question. Okay, so we have 2 questions, 2 questions in the chat, in the Q&A, sorry, and 1 in the chat. So the first question that I'm going to read now is, we've seen how effective. Okay, now we have another question. Okay, we've seen how effective local legislation on FPIC is crucial for driving progress. Developers operating in markets with stronger relations, such as Australia, tend to be more familiar with engagement and due diligence processes. We recommend that BHRC also prioritize advocacy and capacity building for regulators. I don't know if anyone wants to come in, but I can also try to answer. It's definitively one of the recommendations that we make in the report to respond to the challenge on lack of effective legislation that requires FPIC of indigenous people. We know that this is a reality across the majority of jurisdictions. And the point that you mentioned around Australia certainly is correct. So we not only encourage companies to also press governments to adopt better legislation, but that's also, of course, something that we recognize in our own work and priorities, as we insist on the responsibility of the states to provide for effective protection mechanisms for all human rights, including indigenous people's rights. So don't worry, this is also very much at the heart of what we do. But in the benchmark, we insist on the responsibility of companies for the protection of human rights. But obviously, this is not where things stop. So maybe, actually, there's a related question in the chat on indigenous people's rights, on how we've considered challenges that companies can face when they are trying to identify legitimate landowners, especially in cases when the various indigenous peoples in the development area have different views of the legitimacy of each other's claim. It will be useful to have recommendations in this regard. That's an excellent question. But it's certainly something that we've heard from companies that we have engaged with this time and also in the previous benchmark. A few things here. One is that it's definitely key not to stop at complying with national regulations, which sometimes may be insufficient to really do a proper identification of indigenous peoples in a particular area. So that's one bit, but it certainly isn't the only recommendation. Of course, engage with national organizations with expertise. We can also provide recommendations on that type of engagement. I'm also aware that there is guidance that was developed a few years ago by the Danish Institute on Human Rights on checklist for companies on how to do this engagement and identification in a rights-respecting manner. But certainly that remains challenging. So I'm sorry that I can't address this in more details, but those are some starting points. I don't know if Blanca and Anna, you have anything to add on this point.
Yeah, maybe I can just briefly comment on the last point, and this is something that we address in our Exploring Shared Prosperity report, which was released last year, which is a point around really making sure that companies identify the leadership and authority structures that indigenous peoples have and that are seen as legitimate by them. So in other words, what we have seen in quite a few cases is that rather than, for example, respecting the structures and authorities that indigenous peoples have, or even the FPIC processes that the FPIC protocols that they might have written for themselves and published that say what would they as communities see as a legitimate process, that those end up being sort of bypassed, and there's more piecemeal approach with leaders that perhaps might not be seen as legitimate leaders within their structure. So perhaps this is just an obvious but quite an important way of making sure that that the structures that they have and the tools that they have produced are really engaged with and respected.
And maybe just to add that it's important to recognize that even within groups of indigenous peoples, there may be different views, and it's important to recognize that and try to find consensus. And also it's important to recognize that there may be also marginalized groups within recognized land tenure individuals, and therefore it's always important to remember not to only go to the leaders but also look beyond, because there may be other views there. We recognize it's not easy, and maybe that points out to do some work for us to analyze a little bit or put something together more detailed on what can be done, because that's something that we observed as a key challenge. Yeah.
Thanks. And absolutely. Just moving to another great question. Did you also look at working conditions for construction workers at large infrastructure projects, e.g. solar? Due to their remote isolated location, we found that the risk considerably higher than in other construction projects, and cases of modern slavery in Europe have been identified. And so basically, how is this measured? How do we measure this in the benchmark? We do look at how companies approach labor rights in general and issues around forced labor in particular. We've seen some progress in the benchmark in labor rights, but very specifically on occupational health safety policies, and much less so on how risk of forced labor are being, including through supply chains, are being measured and responded to. Another also important piece of work, which we did not mention today, is last week we published a report looking at construction workers in Saudi Arabia in renewable energy projects through desktop analysis, and also workers' testimonies, and we found that unfortunately this is very much prevalent in the region. So again, we only looked at the Gulf area in this particular report, which I'm also happy to share. But yes, this is certainly also an area of progress for some companies. Okay, so I hope that answers, but we have more in the detailed scorecards for each company, as well as in the methodology, if you want to take a look at the type of indicators that we used on management measures and related and related actions. Yeah, already done by Anna. Thank you so much. And yes, and also, yeah, she also shared a guide on FPIC, which is important for companies to take a look at. Okay. I'm gonna move to, okay, there are questions in the chat and in the Q&A, but I think I'm trying to take them in the right order. There's another question on, in relation to the company ranking slide, what criteria has been used for carrying out the evaluation? Yes, I probably should have explained this a bit better. So we have indicators for across 13 different dimensions. Plus, we also look, so that's core UN guiding principles and then salient human rights risk. And then we also look at allegations that have been raised against companies. We assess their response and action and evaluate the performance using certain criteria. And we also look at low carbon transition. So all of these indicators come with a score. And then this is this gives us a final score out of 100, and that's how we rank companies. For the core UN guiding principles, section weighs 20%, salient human rights risk 40%, serious allegations 20%, and low carbon transition 20%. So everything is explained with a lot of details in our methodology, but that's essentially how it's done. So we assess companies and then we rank them based on their scores out of 100. Another question now. How do companies perceive the ongoing initiatives regarding the implementation of binding instruments such as CSDDD or the inclusion of, and also CSRD, I believe, or the inclusion of CSR, environmental, social clause in bilateral and multilateral investment treaties? If there are some companies here, feel free to also react to the question, which is excellent. Like I said, what we saw, and I think this is also coming up pretty strongly from the benchmark, that European companies were already working on the upcoming CSDDD and have, on average, better policies in place as compared to their peers in other regions. And so that's probably also coming from a compliance perspective and anticipation of future regulatory developments, but also how this is going to give them a competitive advantage. So I can't really comment on whether it's perceived positively or negatively, but it certainly is the case that it's driving progress across the board, which we think is a good thing. But we also, what we also hear often from companies is the need for leveling the playing field quite clearly. There are some companies who are trying and achieving a lot of progress on sustainable rollout of renewable energy projects. That certainly is the case. And there's a need to level the playing field with other companies which may not be quite there yet. So in that sense, that's probably positively welcomed. Okay. Sorry, I'm just moving on to the other questions. A question from Stephen. Hi. Please discuss how renewable energy companies can fill the gap of adopting policies for indigenous people's rights that include FPIC, Ørsted as guides. Yes, because Ørsted is the only company that has a policy on prior and informed consent. I'm not sure if your question, Stephen, is on what we think companies should do or what needs to happen. But yeah, certainly is the case that we recommend that companies adopt policies on indigenous people's rights. How can that happen? I think it's also important to recognize, and this was highlighted by Blanca in the presentation, that not only we are seeing allegations of violations of indigenous people's rights, but now we are also seeing increasing risk of litigation. That this has happened across several jurisdictions in the past few years. including in Norway, in Mexico, but also in Kenya. And so when companies do not have the sufficient policies and approaches in place, it's a reputational risk, it's a human rights risk, but it also may be a legal risk. So maybe that provides some incentive for companies to make progress on an area which we recognize remains challenging. Yeah. Okay. I mean, Blanca, Anna, if you want to jump in, sorry, but and now I see a lot of questions, so I'm just trying to run through them. Okay, and please come in as I'm looking at the others.
Maybe
please.
while you're looking, I can take the one on detecting drivers for companies to actively engage around shared prosperity community ownership models. Martin says, I'm assuming it's geo-specific. Are there specific areas leading the way? So one way to answer this, and there are, I think, a few, but is that, yes, it's definitely quite clearly connected in the research we've done with the incentives that the governments can and have put in place. So just to give you the example of Canada, where equity ownership is the most common, NIPs, Indigenous peoples, currently own up to 40 or in some way engaged in up to 40% of renewable energy capacity. The policies that have been put in place, such as the British Columbia Clean Energy Act, but also a requirement that utilities companies prioritize projects that have Indigenous equity participation, those were really crucial. Also, well, as we discussed this with our Canadian counterparts, like these kind of enabling policies were really crucial in driving that high uptake. And Blanca and Caroline might be more able to speak about the non-IP examples, but we know that there have been similar cases in Scotland and a few other countries where the policy conditions were really such that they enabled that rise. Of course, there are other aspects as well, and many companies are seeing it as a competitive advantage to go in this direction, but it's significantly aided by state involvement. I don't know if Caroline or Blanca want to add anything.
Yes, just on this. This is also something that, I mean, you may already know that, but has been tried and tested in South Africa through inclusion of social criteria in public auctions for community, for a share of ownership being allocated to communities. And now, like, I mean, we are working with partners on this, understanding what are the challenges and opportunities in such models. But what we know so far and what comes out of the work of Inspire, which is a network of organizations, including companies in South Africa, who have been really engaging with these models, that they come with challenges and opportunities, but they have actually really allowed for a new conversation between communities and companies. And I can't remember the number of projects, but there are, like, I think it's about 100 projects maybe that have come out to ground with an average of close to 9% of community ownership, and this provides for more support and sustainability of these operations and reduction of risk of social conflict. So this has provided, like, the fact that it's included in public auctions criteria has provided an incentive to really look at these models in South Africa. I think there was another question that I've missed on. Yes. Question from Stina: how may barriers to faster progress on recommendations be bridged? What stakeholders and action can unlock progress who's driving change already? I mean, that's an amazing question, which I wish I could answer in detail. But we are definitely seeing leaders, in the renewable energy space. We've listed a few companies, and you can find them in our briefing. I think the role of enabling policy conditions is crucial, and the role of the state is crucial, which also means conversely, and we've just highlighted it in the context of co-ownership, but conversely, that also means that companies, responsible companies, when they engage with governments, can really unlock potential for change if they press for regulatory reforms where this needs to happen. And the dialogue with civil society in that regard is absolutely key. So it's internal progress within companies, but also how they approach their external environments can really unlock progress, as we also need state action to support further change. But please, again, like Blanca, Anna, please jump in if you want to complete
Well,
this.
if that's okay, and maybe this is a bit of a shameless plug, but I just want to mention one specific initiative, and I guess maybe use it as an illustration of a wider point. I think when it comes to the deep dives, there are very specific processes and spaces that drive progress forward. And so I just want to mention this business network on civic freedoms and human rights defenders that we have set up 9 years ago with the B team and ISHR as one such space. And of course, not the only one, but we have really seen through the network how companies engaging with each other, but also with defenders and civic space experts, so to speak, directly and really unpacking those challenges together has led to quite a bit of progress on companies then really picking up the adoption of zero tolerance policies, which 9 years ago there was one, and now there are at least 54 across various sectors. So just one space, but maybe something that can also be useful on other areas, and that obviously we and others are exploring.
Yes, 100%. The power of collective action also in the renewable energy sector on other key priorities could be a way to unlock progress. There's a similar and related question, which I think is the last one we haven't addressed. What do you see from Leo? What do you see as the main barriers to companies adopting more progressive policies and approaches on human rights, particularly in relation to supply chain partners? Why do you think progress is relatively slow? And what can companies do to encourage faster progress? Yeah, I think we've already touched on a few issues, including in your presentation of the deep dives, Blanca. Sometimes there are issues that are very internal to companies. That's also how we, what we've seen in our many years of doing the benchmark. Sustainability departments not talking enough to public procurement departments is a very common theme that we hear from companies. So I think breaking down this siloed approach is also key for companies to make progress, particularly from a supply chain perspective. Another thing is also recognizing that there are risks that are systemic and that cannot be addressed by one company alone. And this is a very difficult question. If you think about responsible mineral sourcing, for example, companies cannot address through their own policies only so there's a question about joining others. And then regulatory frameworks not being in place in a number of jurisdictions, we've already alluded to that. But then companies there can be a driving force when they adopt the right set of policies, when they engage with governments, and when they press for reforms. Yeah, I think I will keep it to that as we are at time. I think we've addressed all questions. Blanca, Anna, one final word from you, or we can just wrap up. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for attending. Thanks for the amazing questions. This will be, so this was recorded and will be available online later on. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.